Welcome back to Between Two Racks with the Kilo Crew. Today's episode, another installment of Rapid Fire Q&A. So, let's kick it. First question, do you use hip thrusts within your practice? Yes.
Yes.
But let's expand a little bit because previously we did not use them that much. I don't think people were used to seeing you, Stefan, program hip thrusts in your program. And then I know when we moved to Florida, the one new piece that we ordered, because Alex and I requested it, was the hip thrust machine by Atlantis. But in your past, I don't think you've used them as much as now. And so what is your take on the hip thrusts?
It could be a long story, but I'll try to make it short. I don't have anything against the hip thrust per se, but you have to keep in mind that it's in context with the time frame.
Rewind.
So back when I started lifting and when I started athletes, hip thrust was not a thing. Nobody talked about it. It was not a thing. So it was not even part of my personal training experience, repertoire, anything like that. Then it became popular in 2008, 9-ish. Mostly due to Brett Contreras' master's thesis, right? It was on the hip thrust versus the squat.
PhD?
PhD in New Zealand. So then it became like super popular and super relevant. But the problem that I had with it at the time is it was so just obsessed on developing the glutes, and it's glutes, and it's the greatest for glutes. But my thing at the time, especially I was training athletes, like I was not a body part focused coach. I was more of a motor pattern, full range of motion, sport specific. Like, so to me, I was just the hip thrust did not really matter in my bigger picture of programming. Now, is the hip thrust cool for glute development? Is it good for physique athletes? Is it good for athletes at a certain period in time? Yes, it is. But I'll be really honest here. When I'm coaching, like at the time I was coaching 8 to 10 people a day, the last thing I wanted to do was mess around with loading like 7 plates per side on a hip thrust, and all the setup of the hip thrust with the barbell was such a pain. I'm like, I don't care. But now when we moved here in 2021, being in South Florida, Miami, and the whole thing, okay, glutes. But now if we're going to do hip thrust, I want the machine because I want the ease of setup. So now that we have a machine, like I use it even more because it's cool because, yes, it does target the glutes. But it's to me, it's a really good top range posterior chain exercise in terms of hip extension. But what's great is you can actually use it to better balance a microcycle. So if you have on one lower body day, you're working the posterior chain through a long range. Let's say you're doing a seated in the morning. Well, the other day you can kind of balance the difficulty level, if you want, of your training week and a recovery perspective by adding a shorter range hip extension movement like the hip thrust that targets not only through a shorter range but a different part of the strength curve. So instead of overloading the bottom range of the strength curve, we're overloading the top range of the strength curve. So it becomes a very cool complementary remedial exercise to throw into the mix. But because we have the machine and it's so easy, it's so much easier to use, I'm all for it.
Yeah, like I know I've used it for longer, but it's generally been single leg and unilateral variations because the actual application of a barbell hip thrust I never loved because it's just so uncomfortable. Like, because you get really strong really quickly. So like for someone to have 315 pounds on a hip thrust can occur really quickly. So once you hit, to be fair, anything over 225 pounds, it starts to get really uncomfortable. So without getting a bigger setup with the pads and all that, there is never worth it. But like single leg hip thrusts were, for me, based out of a gym with limited equipment, was actually I use that variation a lot, because most people don't need any overload with a single leg hip thrust, and it's a great way, as Steph was saying, to train the shortened range of the posterior chain, and then even better that you're getting to address left-right discrepancies.
I think my resistance at first, when it first came out, because these people were saying that you can do that instead of squats, which is not what Brett was saying. That's not what he says now. He definitely like recommends still squatting and doing the hip thrusts and stuff. But in terms of like the physique industry or competition, like that realm, it definitely changed. It changed everything. Because I remember when I was competing, we did our kickbacks and we did our hip extensions with the cable and stuff. And, people had good glutes. But now it's just ridiculous. Now it's like crazy. And even just in the streets, you see these these girls or like on Instagram. But I think the problem now with a lot of women is they only do glute stuff. Like you still got to work, balance. Like just like when we program, antagonist muscles, we do everything. I think it's probably going to end up not good for a lot of people who only focus on like working the glute and doing hip thrusts.
And a lot of people tend to forget that other exercises works the glutes too. Yeah. It's not just hip thrust.
Yeah, but the ones who want to do the hip thrust is really because they don't want any quads or any hamstrings. So they get that like ant look where it's like two little sticks and then like your ginormous butt.
But the reason why I like the machine a lot though is because like the gluteus max is predominantly fast twitch. So if you're, like Porrick was saying, like past 225, it's starting to get uncomfortable. So if instead of going up in weight, all you ever do is keep increasing the reps, like you see sometimes in commercial gym, you see women doing hip thrust on a lying leg curl machine, and they use a roller pad, and they're popping out like 30 to 50 reps. Well, that's almost useless up to a point, because you're not really maximizing the potential and mass of the glutes since they're fast twitch. So you're better off with lower reps. And by lower, I'm not talking about like doubles and singles, but I'm talking about like 15 reps or less. Like that 6 to 15 rep range would be ideal. Like let's not forget it's a short range of motion. Mm-hmm. So by having a machine, it allows you to load enough comfortably to fall within that 6 to 15 rep range to optimize the growth of the glute. So to me, and now there's so many well-designed hip thrust machine out there. So
I've yet to come across a machine where you can get out of it after your set without looking like a complete ass falling out of it.
Yeah. I mean, there is one, I forget who makes it, but it's like the lever arm just pivots. Oh. So it's easier to get in and out. Yeah. Forgetting which one it is.
Okay, we covered the hip thrusts. Moving on. Your thoughts on tension trainers who say all that matters is tension and not load on the bar?
Squeezers.
Well, I mean, it's a tricky question, and I think the answer is in the detail depending on what the person means. But and this is a very hypertrophy bias kind of question, okay? So technically speaking, in order for a muscle fiber to grow, that muscle fiber needs to perceive a certain amount of load that's creating tension upon the muscle fiber, okay? So tension is the most important thing in order to generate a hypertrophy response. Now, how do you create tension? So if the load on the barbell was not important, then just squeezing your bicep as hard as you can a couple times a day would get you really, really jacked. Or doing functional range systems, internal strength model would build bodybuilders. But it's not necessarily the case. And one of the reasons might be that William Kramer actually defines resistance training in his latest book as, like, I forget exactly the word he's using, but he's basically saying that the muscles responds to an external stress to generate tension. So the load on the bar should, according to that definition, have an impact on the amount of tension the muscle can produce. So to me, they go hand in hand. So, like, assuming that the trainee has the inter and intramuscular ability and technical skill to feel and isolate a muscle when he's doing a movement, up to a certain point, the more load he can put on the bar, the more tension that he can create upon that specific muscle fiber. And then, let's say we're pulling out of the hypertrophy world a little bit, which I'm sure that question comes from. Then there's also performance. So if I'm a powerlifter or I'm an athlete and I'm doing a squat, well, I'm not as worried about the tension that my vastus lateralis is feeling throughout my range of motion of a back squat. I'm more focused about, well, how much load that this movement pattern can displace, what velocity I can displace that load, and on and on and on, because the athlete, we're looking to improve a movement pattern, not simply isolate a muscle structure for the purpose of hypertrophy. So it's very multifaceted. It depends where from which sphere that question came from. So if I'm training an athlete, well, I'm worried about the load on the bar. If I'm training a bodybuilder, I'm worried about the load on the bar, but I'm more so worried about the bodybuilder's ability to feel the muscle that he's working when he's doing a specific exercise. And once he feels it, well, the more load you can put, the more tension the muscle can create. So the more hypertrophy you can gain. So we cannot completely discredit the importance of load on a barbell for the quest for muscle size, because like I said before, if it was the case, you could just squeeze your muscles as hard as you can and you'd be jacked as hell. But nobody's ever become jacked that way.
Yeah, but and there'd be absolutely no way to gauge progress. So if all you're worried about is how much tension you're creating, like, how do you know from week to week you're creating more tension? Like, the simplicity of adding a couple of pounds to a barbell or dumbbells just takes that guesswork out of the equation. It's like,
yeah, that's a good point. Like, assuming everything is the same, assuming your technique is the same, your intent is the same, your control is the same. If you're adding 5 pounds to your bench press from 1 week to the next, you're by default withstanding more tension.
Yeah. And then, like, obviously, if you're creating a high level tension and adding reps, you're creating more total tension over the course of a set. But at some stage, like, where do you go? Like, you can't just keep adding reps for life. Like, at some stage you need to change that. Like, if that was the case, you'd be doing sets of 50 for everything at some stage. Like, it just doesn't make sense.
So would there be, I'm going to go out there. So if someone really likes to do the squeezing thing, could they use overcoming isometrics and then get some hypertrophy benefit from doing that?
Well, that's kind of cool that you bring that up, because that was going to be my next point. Okay? Like, isometric, because if squeezing and tension that you're creating on your own was the end all to hypertrophy, then why is it that isometric contraction have a minimal direct impact on hypertrophy? It does, but it's minimal, it's indirect, and it's definitely not actual hypertrophy. So it's not the hypertrophy where the cross-section area of the muscle belly will actually increase like a bodybuilder would. So again, that kind of proves to me, like, the overcoming, what it really does. I mean, if it's an overcoming in a lengthened position, you will create some in-series hypertrophy increase. But this will not necessarily manifest itself with a bigger muscle belly. But what it does, those overcoming isometric, is it allows your brain to be more efficient at recruiting more motor units. So afterwards, when you're doing movement, you can use more motor units. So now you have more muscle fibers that are integrated to the movement that you can potentially increase in size. So that's why I'm saying it's indirect, but it's not a direct response. So isometric are not this very targeted specific hypertrophy builder.
Yeah. And I know this one's somewhat cost prohibitive, but if tension was all that matters, do you not think isokinetic machines would be way more popular?
True.
Yeah, because you're setting like your meters per second and you go as hard as possible and you're creating as high level tension as possible within that velocity zone. But they do cost more, but I'm sure if they were significantly better for hypertrophy, someone would have found a way to make them for cheaper at this stage, whereas it's just not a thing. It's only in laboratory settings.
Yeah, and like even like some bodybuilders in the late 70s started messing around with isokinetic machines, but how come by 1990 no bodybuilders were using it anymore?
Exactly.
Gotta lift some weights.
Yeah. And everyone get jacked from doing EMS.
Yeah.
Whereas, can you add muscle? Yes, but it's not significant.
Yeah, but the problem with that, though, is you're bypassing the central nervous system.
Oh, I know, but it's just adding muscle.
Yeah. Yeah.
During which training period do you suggest using post activation potentiation?
I mean, any speed strength phase, you could use PAP.
Yeah, but you could even use it for peaking of strength. So like anytime we use waves as part of our strength peaking phase, there's an element of PAP there.
So PAP you can get via reps and via like movement type of like.
It's more, so once you're lifting loads above the 80%, you're increasing your neural drive and your ability to recruit motor units in that there. So that there's creating a post activation potentiation for you to create more force in that movement pattern or a similar movement pattern. Force or velocity, because you can increase force at low speeds or low velocities, or forces at high velocities. But that's what I'm saying. Like, if we say we're doing a 3-2-1 wave, like your 3, that's going to be done at over 80%. So it's going to give us somewhat of a potentiation effect for your 2. Your 2 is going to give somewhat of a potentiation effect for your 1. Your 1's going to then potentiate the next full wave because it was significantly higher and you're backing off in the load. So now things are going to start moving faster, even if the load's slightly increased. But since anything over 80% starts to give this PAP effect, like technically we could do it every session if you include your warm-up sets. Because a lot of people will warm up to one heavier set and then back off and then do their working sets after that. That's creating a PAP effect. So it just depends on the context that you're trying to use it.
So you know when Porg does his lecture on warm-up and he talks about the super training's quote of leaving traces?
Yeah.
Well, that's what PAP does, because what happens is you're targeting high threshold motor units. So now these high threshold motor units have been activated. So there's traces of high threshold motor units that being activated. So then when you go to your heavy lift or your dynamic lift, you can more readily access these fibers to potentiate the training effect of either strength or speed. But what's interesting, though, is the more advanced you are, the more you'll benefit from, and especially if it's in a speed strength and even more so in a reactive strength phenomenon, you will potentiate from PAP even more by doing overcoming isometrics, because the overcoming isometric will push you beyond your 1RM concentric, which means that by that point, you'll be recruiting a high amount of 2X fibers, which are the fibers that will be mostly used in a plyometric movement. So if you truly want to potentiate speed and you have the strength level and the training age 4, doing PAP via overcoming ISO is probably your biggest benefit. But the thing, though, you need to have a certain amount of strength in order for PAP to matter Because like if you do PAP with a novice, it won't do anything.
No. And then for the overcoming ISO, like the training age is a huge factor, because since the isometric is so much further away from the dynamic rep that you're going to be trying to potentiate, it takes a way more efficient nervous system and someone who's way more in tune to try and reap those benefits. That's why like doing a heavy rep is way easier to get the post-activation potentiation effect than an overcoming ISO. But once you have the ability to utilize that overcoming ISO, it has a greater overall effect.
And when you're using the overcoming ISO in the warm-up like you're talking about, if I remember correctly, it's about like multiple sets and then you're ramping up the intensity of the overcoming ISO.
This was just my interpretation of it, because the literature just says you use an overcoming isometric, but so this is in the context of power. So in the context of power, we never want to complete any work in a fatigue state. So I was going to do multiple sets of a single overcoming isometric, because all we're trying to do is get the stimulation. So a single overcoming isometric where we're building up over the course of 6 seconds to the first time you do your first rep, you're going to go and build up to 80% of what your perceived max output is. So we're just getting in, we're tapping into it. And the next time, the next set you come, then we're going to just push that a little further, go to 90. Then finally, the last set you go and you'll really try and hit that peak of your maximum output. But it's ramping up over the course of the 6 seconds as well as ramping up over the sets. Because we don't want to say, all right, just go in, pull 100% for all 6 seconds, because that's grim. So we're going to say, all right, come in, and for the last second of the 6 seconds, hit your maximum. So build like 40, 60, 80, and then the last second or two, you're really going for it as much as possible, just because it's going to provide all the same benefits than going all out from the very start without causing the fatigue.
Because we're not trying to train isometrics, we're trying to use isometric to potentiate. So that's the big difference. And then we know that the minimum intensity threshold to have any type of potentiation response is 80% of concentric 1RM. So that first rep, you just need to get beyond that point, and then you build it up, like he's saying, building it up, just so you get that activation of the fibers. That's all you want.
Who trained Ben Johnson? What was his name?
Charlie Francis.
Charlie Francis. So remember when we took that course and he was telling us how he trained him even before he raced and stuff, and he was doing that's what that was, right? He was doing a 1RM squat basically, and then he went out and freaking ran 100 meters.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Did he do the squat before it, or did he bench press?
He did the squat.
He did do the squat.
Yeah. I don't think it was a 1RM. I think it was a 90% of 1RM for 1 to 2 reps or something like that.
So do you think if he'd done an overcoming isometric, it would have been better than doing? I mean, that's what he was used to, but I guess.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
I have no idea. Like who know? Like
yeah.
if he had never done a overcoming ISO, probably not.
Sure.
Moving on, for hypertrophy, what is best between 4x12 with step loading or 4x12 to failure?
So
4x12 to failure. I mean, what is best?
Yeah, well, so it's pretty much we're asking if we should step load or constant load. What is best is what the person can achieve and recover from.
Well, yeah. Because
if you have the work capacity to go 4x12 constant loading with a very minimal drop off in your load, and you're actually training at 12 RM, fantastic. If you go in and try and do that, but your reps look like 12, 8, 6, and 5, you're so far away from your volume target that you're wasting your time. So if the person has a high work capacity and the ability to have those repeated efforts and sustain that load, great. If not, they're safer off doing getting their rep volume in and use step loading.
And then I would assume when you're answering this, you're thinking the A series is being the question.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. If they're talking about B and C series, they shouldn't, since it's not as demanding of movements as a generality, you shouldn't have the same level of drop off.
Yeah, I mean, the question was a little misleading in the sense that we don't know, was that a primary exercise, an assistance exercise? Constant loading does not necessarily mean that the person is training to failure per se, so it's a little misleading. But Borik's right, though. I mean, technically speaking, doing 4x12 to failure would lead to a greater hypertrophy response, but only and only if the client can recover from it. And if it's a primary movement that has some complexity to it, well, that's a different story too. So, yeah, I think for most people, the majority of the time, A series primary movement, even if it's hypertrophy, you'll be better off step loading it. Then once you reach a certain level of conditioning and ability, you can go for broke right off the bat, but it's just not a lot of people can actually do that.
Could you do like a reverse step load? So you start at your 12 RM, decrease the weight, try to hit another 12 RM in your second, third, fourth set?
You can, but that to me is like some way more advanced type of technique. Like you're
but it would also
every time.
And to me, it's so much less effective for strength that you're going to shortchange yourself long term. Because if you're step loading towards peak load, you're just going to get such a better strength response that at least further down the line, you're going to be doing all these primary exercises at a higher load. So you're going to be in a better position to...
But that's like if you're doing like a regular strength training with a hypertrophy focus. But let's say if you're doing like giant sets, trisets, you're doing methods and stuff.
It's so different. Yeah.
So
then there's two approaches here. Mm-hmm. When it's first introduced and you have zero knowledge of how your body is going to respond, you don't have any type of work capacity, I would say start conservative, then build up. Once you've been doing it for a while, then you can use your approach where you're going for your 12 RM, but now you know that you might have some fatigue. So let's say that round 2, you only did 10 reps. Well, then round 3, I would decrease the load 10%, and then you try to do 12 again, and on and on. Then you decrease again. But those super high metabolic stress methods, depending on if you're focusing on hypertrophy or fat loss, you can have an intensity drop-off of anywhere from 20% for hypertrophy all the way up to 50% for fat loss, and you're still fine. But this is only once you're at like a very high level, and between you and I, there's just not many people who are there yet.
Yep.
And everyone else listening, not just used to get the... No.
What?
You said between you and I.
Yeah, true. And everybody else.
Okay. How do you progress the split squat with a general population client? Such a weird question.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on
their
flexibility.
ability.
Yeah, sometimes you have to stick to one thing for a long time, but typically we start with front foot elevated.
If they need it. That's what's funny. It's like, so how do you progress the split squat with a general population client? Well, you assess them and see what they're currently capable of, and you start them at their current capability.
Yeah, because a gen pop doesn't necessarily mean they can't move. It just means they haven't trained.
Yeah.
So if your client can do a proper, on a mobility standpoint, split squat from the floor, well, the only progression now that we need to worry about is the load. It's not the exercise technique, right? If they have no range, well, you elevate the front foot. 6 foot's not enough. Go up 8 inches, 6 inches. 8 inches not enough. Go up 10 inches.
Yep.
Then once you find the position that they're able to do with proper form, then you seal that position and then you progress. And then the rear foot elevated split squat would be the most advanced version of your split squat. So go through all the steps before you get to that one.
I have a question with that one. So if you're progressing through, like, to you, is the progression of a split squat like the first progression before you get to a lunge? Like, is the rear foot elevated split squat before a lunge, or could you go to a lunge?
You don't need to. Yeah, like the only reason you'd ever need to do a rear foot elevated is if you wanted to introduce drop lunges. because that's a very similar degree of flexibility needed. But there's no, like, if someone is never going to have the ability to get to a rear foot elevated, it doesn't mean they can never lunge. Like, a foot flat on floor is more than enough mobility for them to completely lunge.
I mean, I just want to make sure everybody understands here. He's talking specifically for Gen Pop.
Oh, yeah.
Because there would be a reason for a wide receiver to do a rear foot elevated split squat, irrespective of lunging or not. If they need to increase rec fem and hip flexor dynamic mobility for stride length, for example. But as a carryover to lunge, that has no bearing whatsoever. Aside what he's saying, if you're doing a drop lunge.
But again, like, how many Gen Pop really need to do drop lunges? Like, it's like,
true.
If they like to ski, I could get on board, but outside of that, they don't really need it.
Yeah. I mean, I was saying it over the weekend with the group we had. I mean, split squat is great, but I don't know what's people's fascination with split squat. It's not like people almost talk about this as it's the freaking holy grail of strength training. I mean, it has a lot of positive, but at one point, it's not that magical. It's okay to move away from your split squat.
Yep.
But that being said, people just need to get used to doing split squats because they come very often into your program. Some variation of it often is in the B series.
Yeah, if you suck at them. Okay. Like, as long as you suck at them, you'll have split squat in your B series. As long as once you're good at them, you shouldn't have split squats in your B series. I mean, that's my take. Like, what? Like, why keep doing something you're already great at?
Well, but so take me for instance. I know it was getting back to training, but I don't necessarily suck at split squats, and I still had them in my program. I think that's what she's saying.
Yeah, but it was preparation for lunges.
Yeah,
because we're getting back into it. But for the most part, like, I'll program way more lunges with you than split squat.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, if you look at the course of your training year, like, your volume of split squat, the lunges, or other variations it might be like 10 to 15% split squats, with everything else being included way more often. But you also do a lot of step ups instead of split squats. Yeah.
Sorry, I cut you off.
But if someone never gets to the level that their strength and their mobility is there, they're going to have a lot of split squats, because you need to do the split squat to improve that. But once it's there, you can get away from it.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like a lot of people think that B1 on a lower body session has to be a split squat. Well, we teach this in the program design course because that's the first step, and that's where your Gen Pop will start at. That's where most people are. And your Gen Pop, to Alex's point, because Alex has trained a bazillion Gen Pop in her lifetime, they will be doing split squats almost every freaking session. Why? Because their rate of progress is horrible. Why? Because their compliance and consistency to training is horrible. So they're never really progressing because they train 1.7 times per week, and they miss 3 weeks over Christmas and 1 month in the summer and this and that. So of course they're going to have split squats for the next 12 years. But if you're training somebody that's truly dedicated to their training, once you've reached certain mobility threshold and strength standards, that exercise becomes like
annoying.
Fairly, it's like that would be the equivalent of somebody doing standing neck support on ball for neck work for the rest of their lives. Okay, so it's the same thing to me.
Yeah, it's just been glamorized, that exercise.
You're allowed to put your knees over your toes.
Yeah. This is kind of same type of question. Why don't you prescribe Petersen step-ups higher than 12 reps? Because nobody knows how to do them.
Coordination, balance, stability.
Yeah, and I think this just goes back to the Petersen step-ups being properly executed, because a lot of people just act like
Yeah.
the heel's elevated and then you're just dropping up and down. They're not really realizing how broken up that movement entirely is.
Yeah, I don't understand why. I don't understand why people can't seem to look at something and mimic it, because that movement on
Butchered.
social media is butchered like nothing else. But if you're doing it properly, like the way Carl Petersen meant for it to be done, it's really hard to do more than 12 simply because of balance component.
Yeah. And when you get good at them, you do load them, so it's just it gets difficult.
Because as fatigue sets in, it's really hard to get that full plantar flexion and stay in balance on that one leg. I mean, it's...
Most people don't have the calf strength alone
Sure.
to do more than 12 reps. Because like if you put someone on the stand calf, like, so there's a test that you just do a single leg calf raise on a metronome, and how many you get done, you're trying to do max reps, but lots, like the standard number that people aim for was 20. And they're coming up with more research now saying that number actually should be higher, but the amount of people that never get to 20 reps on that test is phenomenal. So to be able to actually hold that foot position and produce force to extend your knee in that position, most people aren't strong enough.
While you're bending the knee and keeping the torso perpendicular to the floor.
Yeah, it's not just doing like a calf raise. So there's so much more happening. So it's a really, really advanced exercise when you take all the considerations into it.
And you can watch a properly performed one in our exercise database. And I think we also have like a long form video on Petersen step ups, if I remember correctly.
Alex will definitely be the demo there.
And then let's see. With team sports athletes, do you start the off season with a phase of hypertrophy?
You definitely can if they need it.
You can assess them with the athlete off-season assessment course and see what they need.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely can. Like obviously, we like the first phase. Typically, is if they had a long season and they've detrained a lot, we do like that first phase to be more anatomical adaptation driven. So a little bit more on
PAB,
like PAB type of workout, but the loading and the modalities and time under tension are very in line with hypertrophy anyways. But like assuming there's no issues, you could legit start with hypertrophy, no problem. I mean, hypertrophy, if you have low levels of it, leverages strength and power. So there's no reason why not to spend time on it.
But when we say hypertrophy in this context, it's not giant sets, it's not trisets.
Yeah.
This is hypertrophy in the context of strength training. So we're going and we're just lifting in the slightly higher rep ranges. So somewhere from 8 to 12, sort of 9 to 12 rep range, and trying to drive more volume load.
Yeah,
but
that's an important point.
Yeah, because athlete off seasons have to be so specific that you cannot cause undue stress and undue fatigue for the sake of it's a cool method.
Yeah.
Like you have to be super specific and really, because you have to cause a lot of fatigue. There's no doubt about it. You have to saturate the hell out of qualities, but you have to be really careful with how you do it and when you do it, because there's only so much time for them to then recover and adapt and like transmutate all those changes into actual performance outcomes. So you just have to be really careful with that. So unless someone has a very, very, very long off season, your hypertrophy work should just look like a normal accumulation based strength training session.
Yeah. Like in that, like 60 as a minimum threshold all the way to 80%.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there ever a time when you would consider changing the remedial exercises every week?
There is. Someone, to me, that would be with somebody really, really, really advanced who doesn't have any glaring issues. So you just want to go through a macro cycle, for example, while hitting everything, just to make sure that everything is kind of stimulated but you're not saturating anything. You're not overdeveloping anything. You're just kind of like maintaining a wide range of remedial movements.
Kind of like with the 14-day microcycle, you kind of do it.
Yes and no, because you still repeat those on a 14-day rotation. Because like while you definitely can do what Steph said, most people are never going to be there.
Yeah.
Because most people, if they're in that situation, are going to fuck up their loads, and they're never going to get actual training sets done because they're week one they go in and it's like, oh, that was a little easy, and then they don't see it again for another 12 weeks, so they're not going to remember where their loading should be. I think
remedial exercises, well, besides just loading in general being an issue, but like people definitely just kind of like go through the motions of remedial exercises for the most part.
100%.
But I mean,
but you could do like, let's say if you're doing external rotation within one training session, you could do 3 positions. You could do there, and at least if you're trying to get as much, if you're trying to hit like a bunch of different motor patterns more frequently, I think you probably get more benefit from doing it that way.
Yeah, but again, you're setting a trend. Like you basically have a 3 exercise rotation, but you still have a rotation.
Yeah.
The question is, could you for 12 weeks straight never repeat once the same remedial movement?
Yeah, no.
So in order for this to make any sense, you need to be at such a high level,
for sure.
not only of knowing exercises, knowing loads, but to not have any true glaring discrepancy. Like to the top of my head from my online clients that I have right now, there's maybe just one that could do this.
Yeah.
But he's been training with me for 12 years. Yeah. So it's just not, because everybody, even with rotator cuff, right? So obviously most of the rotator cuff movement will target the infraspinatus and teres minor, whatever. I get that. But if you're someone who has a harder time on a strength ratio perspective hitting a target when the arm is adducted to the side as opposed to abducted in front, well, why wouldn't I just spend more time doing adducted to the side so that movement pattern within these targeted muscle can actually progress faster? So a lot of people are in that predicament. So it's just far and few the amount of people where you can just be like all over the place at random with remedial and be like, okay, he's going to be good.
Yeah. Like the only way, like on a loading perspective, would just be and it's not something I would like to do, but give a wide rep range and just make sure that they're going to not fail, because we don't, like, especially for shoulder remedials, we don't really train them to failure. But so at least they've got a wider berth of how many reps they can complete, so at least get to the point that it's challenging. But
I mean, you could even go the other, like complete 180 degree from that statement, because of the fact that shoulder remedial, especially, the technique of the movement pattern is so important, because you really don't want to have any sort of compensations when you're working in these muscles, because if you use assisting muscle, they're going to overpower these tiny muscles. Like I was actually reading on this week, actually, like the rotator cuff, like the 4 muscles of the rotator cuff are actually almost more like tendinous structure than actual muscle fibers. So in that sense, like, it's so easy to compensate and steer away from these muscles that you want to be so specific about the movement pattern and the technique. So you do want to leave a few reps in the tank to have quality work. But then if that's the case, what's the greatest way to increase rate of success when you're not training to full failure? Frequency. Yeah. So you might actually argue that you're better off doing those twice a week, the exact same thing, if you have this discrepancy, instead of having the wide array of non-targeted exercises.
I wonder where that question comes from. Like, why would they even want to do that?
Boredom.
Yeah. Doing this
versus this is pretty much the same thing.
Like, I don't know if that question comes from that, but a lot of powerlifting coaches uses that approach. Okay. like the approach of you have your primary main lift, you got a few key accessory lifts, because I tend to use the word accessory more, and then you have your supplemental work, or aka remedial, and a lot of them they don't care. For example, they'll write triceps instead of writing a specific exercise.
Yeah. It's not how we do things.
No, but like we could, like, why would a power lifter do that though? I'm not saying I would do this, but
because they're so locked in with their movement patterns for their primary, because their sport is 3 exercises, so at least that's creating more variety.
Yeah, at least it's one way to create some type of variety, because they're always, especially if they're West Side, like, it means on every Monday, they're bench pressing and they work it up to a peak load. So I mean, it's a little different.
Yeah, it's different. Okay. How do you program the squat if you really want to work on your deadlift strength?
It's funny that the question is not about how would you program the deadlift if you want to work on your deadlift strength, but
it's probably someone that doesn't want to not squat but wants to drive the deadlift.
So when working your deadlift, you have to just be somewhat careful with how much back squatting you do, because they're both are going to be fatiguing on the lower back. So one really easy way to do that is, since you're going to be working on your deadlift, that means your deadlift should be present in intensification phases. So a very easy way to complement that is, instead of back squatting in intensification phases, you front squat, because you're going to be at such much more upright torso angle. You're not going to cause the same level of fatigue in the lower back. You are going to cause more fatigue in the upper back, but that should recover and not take away from your deadlift performance as much as fatigue in the lower back. Easy.
Yeah. Otherwise, like, if you really do want to back squat, it's going to be 2 things. Either you find a back squat variation that keeps you upright, like a quad squat or a cyclist squat or a barbell hack squat, or you do your back squat but in a low volume quasi maintenance level, just to say, I'm not trying to drive my back squat up. I just want to maintain my intermuscular or motor skill rehearsal, because my squat technique isn't great, so I don't want to lose this while I'm focusing on deadlift. So I'm still going to do it, but it's going to be sub-maximal and it's going to be low volume. And by sub-maximal, just for people to understand, like, you might be working, let's say, at 70 or 80% of 1 RM, but you'll perform like 3 to 6 reps, let's say. So you're just rehearsing the movement. You're not draining anything.
Okay, we have 2 more questions, but one more theory question. When training athletes, when do you know their calves and abs need more remedial work?
When they're weak.
Well, generally, as long as the athlete's not performing a ton of high velocity sprinting, there's no disadvantage than keeping calf work in there. Yep. If these, like, generally for their off season, you'd want to train calves throughout, but if it does start impeding speed work, I'd still keep it, but reduce the volume or reduce the frequency, because calf strains are now becoming more and more prevalent in sports, and it's probably because people are shying away from
avoiding doing
training calves. It's really important for knee stability, ankle function. So, like, there's a ton of benefits of training calves. I know, and it's funny enough, I listened to a podcast about this yesterday. Irish Rugby, one thing that they test, I think it's on a monthly basis, it might be every 3 weeks, is a isometric seated calf raise using force plates, because they want to make sure that there's no sign of drop-offs, because if they see a drop-off, they know it's either going to be that there's been a level of overtraining is about to occur, or there may be somewhat of an injury coming up. So, like, that's the extent that they go to make sure that calf strength is where it needs to be, and the very specific markers of strength that they want to be able to hit. Abs, we do have a test for in the off-season programming, so you can get that.
You can get that.
But, like, Like, let's get back to the calf real quick. Like, I agree with everything Bork said. The calf, to me, as a strength coach, I find that it's always been underrated. And I always remember the story, man. Like when we moved to Huntington Beach, and we were training at the what's the name? Equinox. They once a month, Equinox would bring in an outside coach to teach their trainers. And one time, like, I was actually doing calf raise while the outside instructor was teaching the Exos trainers that in strength and conditioning, not Exos.
We get you.
Fuck, it could be the same thing. I don't know. He was telling them that for strength and conditioning, training the calf is absolutely useless because it does not improve your vertical jump. As I'm doing calves, I'm looking at them like, wow, what a weird
way to look at it.
Way to look at it, as if like there was just one.
The only function.
Yeah, that the only goal of a strength coach is to improve the vertical. So if the calf raise doesn't improve it, you shouldn't do it. Wow, I was flabbergasted. But a lot of coaches don't do it. And then actually last year at the NSCA conference, Brian Munn in his lecture straight up said that one mistake he did early in his career that he wished he didn't do is he was one of those who believed that training calf was not important until he realized that training calf made a huge difference. So now he always trained the calf. So, I mean, calf to me, you train it. Like Bork said, if your off-season calls for a lot of sprinting at one point, especially as you're entering the SPP, okay, you need to be careful, especially with stuff like anterior tibialis raise just because of the foot strike. But abs, man, like abs to me, like everybody's weak as hell. Like people think that they have strong abs because they squat and deadlift, but telling you, there's not a lot. Like early in my career, I'd see people with strong abs, but I just think people are not doing abs anymore. People are weak as hell. There's some tests for Gen Pop you can do that are a little less invasive, that are a little bit more isometric dominant, and you look at strength endurance that are very telling. But with the athletic people, we like more of a true expression of strength type of test, and most people are just weak, so you need to train it throughout.
Yeah. There's no detriment to having stronger abs.
Yeah,
no,
there's no downside, so just train them.
No, but like... Did I say this in class or the last podcast? I'm forgetting. But look at all these successful Olympic weightlifting systems. Like in their early stages, what they all do, shit ton of lower back, shit ton of abs.
Yep.
Like they literally do a ton of volume in the early stages to set the tone, to have that strong foundation to be able to do what they need to do. Because trust me, if your lower back or abs are weak, every time you squat and deadlift and front squat and all that kind of stuff, you'll be walking all week at a 72-degree angle because your lower back is fried.
Yeah, and it's so... Again, it goes back to people getting bored with doing abs or half-assing their abs, not sticking to it every time they have it in their program. But I know personally for me, and I know I've talked about it on the podcast, but once we focused and we got my abs really strong, it made the world of difference in all of my training. I just felt fucking good when I was squatting, like deadlifting. Everything felt different once my abs were really strong.
You increased your ab strength like crazy, and it's like you don't need to do it 5 times a week for 30 minutes at a time.
Yeah, but you need to do it when you're doing
with
them.
intent.
Yeah.
And then Steph said one other really important thing is that the Olympic lifting systems use a shit ton of volume for abs. And it's one thing I hate to admit because I hate doing it is you need to have a strength endurance base before you work on pure strength side of things for abs. Because if you don't have that strength endurance base, there's always going to be a breakdown at some point. So you have to build that. So it could be higher rep stuff, or it could just be isometrics for longer durations and more stability-based things, but you do need to build the strength endurance side, which is very unfortunate because it sucks.
But then you see so many people that just do abs like crazy. Every time they're in between sets, they do like 200, 300 abs a day. You don't need to go that far.
And loads of those people are the people with back issues, because while they might have really strong abs, they're not then doing the reverse and doing the antagonist and training their glutes and lower back. So you need to do everything in proportion, especially as we were talking about the hip thrust earlier. For all those girls that all they do is fucking hip thrust, they're fucking going to be in absolute agony if they don't have strong enough abs to counteract that musculature.
And the endurance base, it's so important for hip extension and hip flexion, or abs and lower back, but it's also really important for the shoulder girdle too. Yeah. Like all of those cap retractors and rotator cuffs, like you need to start with some form of strength endurance base. That's why our PAB structure, the TUT in the accumulation phase, is so freaking high for those, because you need first to have some strength endurance component if you want to successfully strengthen and load those. Yeah. So that concept can be taken to a lot of those anchor type of musculature.
Yep, 100%.
That was a pretty rapid fire episode.
That's it.
Yeah. So one final question is, I know someone asked this on our YouTube channel. Specifically, they only asked Stefan and Porik.
but they're going to get our opinions.
What are your best lifts ever?
You can go first. I have to think about mine.
I don't like it. It's either my deadlift or bench. So my like at a body weight of 210, my best bench was 435, so over 2 times body weight bench.
Were you using tempo?
Yeah, that was on a 40x0 mid grip bench. So that was pretty good, because not many people go, at least not with that tempo raw, like a over 2 times body weight. So I would say that's pretty good. But my deadlift, like my best ever, was the 6 reps at 555. Not kilos, pounds. With a 4-1x0 tempo, clean grip, no strap.
No straps.
Yeah, so those 2 are my best, for sure.
Yeah, mine would either be deadlift or squat. These kilos, so I'm doing quick math in my head. I deadlifted 235 kilos, so like 515, 520. It was only for one. And then squat, I squatted 177 kilos for 3. Those are my 2 biggest lifts, which is like 177, 390, 400 for 3. Yeah.
Alex?
My best upper body was bench for sure, 185 for 1.
Jeez, yeah.
40x0.
We're what,
body
like
weight
130?
Yeah,
Yeah, 140, I don't know, somewhere in that. And then deadlift was 285 for 2, but I did use straps. I never did 1 on the deadlift. Weird. But it was for 2 reps, but definitely use straps. Yeah.
Mine would just be without tempo, because it was when I was training Olympic weightlifting, but a back squat of 320. Yeah. Just
boom.
Down and up.
I mean, it's almost
low as hell.
Just as impressive. Yeah. Because you have to fucking absorb that.
Okay. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week, fam.